Welcome to another episode of India Defence News. In today's episode, we are going to discuss and analyze why India lost 1962 war with China. It is important to understand these historical facts so that we do not allow this to happen ever again in future. The India-China War fought in 1962 is a story of betrayal of Indian friendship and trust by China. It is also important to analyze the chain of events that led to this war and the reasons why India lost this war.
In this war, India was defeated by the failure of its own leadership, and not by China, and this was the saddest part of the 1962 war. The 1962 war is also a story of how political interference in army's command structure can lead to disastrous consequences.
India Defence News brings you the latest news, updates and articles on defence, Indian Armed Forces, strategic affairs and foreign relations. If you like this video, then please give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. Now, let's get started. The Sino-Indian War was also an outcome of some of the biggest and worst blunders in India's strategic planning and diplomacy. The opposition parties had blamed this to the government of the day for its failure to access the deteriorating situation on the border and reading the Chinese intentions. This war had also exposed some serious gaps in Indian strategic planning and defences. Every proud Indian must know these historical blunders, because yet another war between India and China in future cannot be ruled out. The India-China War was started by China on the 20th of October 1962 with the invasion of India by the Chinese army. The Chinese army had invaded India on the Western Front, that is Aksai Chin Area, and on the Eastern Front, in NEFA area in Arunachal Pradesh. The India-China War lasted for almost a month, and ended on the 22nd of November 1962, with the unilateral ceasefire declared by China. In this Sino-Indian War, India lost strategically important Aksai Chin Area of the Indian territory to China, and almost 3,000 brave Indian soldiers who laid down their life and fought till their last breath. The wounds inflicted by China to India during this Sino-Indian War has still not healed, even after the passage of over 50 years. This war has taught many important lessons to India, and this was a turning point in India-China relations. In order to understand the chain of events that led to this war, we must look back in the history and how India-China relations had evolved between 1950 onwards till First India-China War in 1962. Both India and China got their independence more or less at the same time, but each followed different ideologies. India became independent on the 15th of August 1947 after the end of over 2 centuries of British rule. China, on the other hand, came to existence in 1950 after end of Chinese Civil War. China opted for single-part rule communist model of governance, whereas India opted for a democracy. The Chinese Civil War fought during 1927 to 1950 between the Nationalist Party of China and the Communist Party of China. The Nationalist Party of China was led by Chiang Kai-shek, which was supported by Western countries including US. Whereas the Communist Party of China was led by Mao Zedong, which was supported by Russia. During the Chinese Civil War, Japan had invaded China and occupied some Chinese territory. However, with defeat and surrender of Japan in the end of Second World War, the Japanese occupation of China also came to an end. The Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of Communist Party, which controlled the major part of China and that led to the creation of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party had eventually taken the firm grip on China by 1949 after a prolonged battle with China's Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party lost the Civil War and was restricted to the newly formed state of Taiwan. The Nationalist Party still claims the real representative of Republic of China. The newly formed People's Republic of China, ruled by the Communist Party, initially faced major challenges and had to struggle for its recognition as a legitimate representative of the state of China. The Western countries, including the United States, were against the Communist Party-ruled China and supported the Nationalist Party-ruled Taiwan, which was a democracy. During this time, India provided the crucial support to the Communist Party-ruled China in getting the crucial recognition. In fact, India became the first country to give this crucial initial recognition and established formal diplomatic ties with the newly formed the People's Republic of China. The Indian government, led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, had declined the most prestigious and important permanent seat at United Nations Security Council offered by the United States to India. This was a historic blunder, and India should not have passed this crucial seat to China in 1960. This decision by Prime Minister Nehru had serious ramifications for India. India is still paying the price for allowing China to get a permanent seat in United Nations Security Council. China is now misusing the veto power against India and providing the protection to an international terrorist and Mumbai attack mastermind, Hafiz Saeed, operating from Pakistan. After India's independence in 1947, India-China relations were quite good, despite the existence of unsettled border dispute between the two countries. The Indian government, led by Congress Party, under the leadership of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, had continued the policy of extending full support to China on all important international issues, including the illegal occupation of Tibet by China. The Western countries, led by the US, had opposed the illegal occupation of Tibet by China. The Indian government's blind support to a Communist Party-ruled China on many such issues was one of the important reasons why US policies were not favorable to India during this period. During this period, there was a regular exchange to visits between the leaders of China and India. The warmth in the relations due to frequent mutual exchange visits led to the famous Panchsheel Agreement, signed between the two countries in year 1954. The leadership of both the countries had agreed to lay down the foundation of India-China relations based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, known as the Panchsheel Agreement. These 5 principles of Panchsheel Agreement are: 1. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. 2. Mutual non-aggression. 3. Mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. 4. Equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. And finally, peaceful coexistence. The Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru always had best intentions for China, and he had once said, if these principles were recognized in the mutual relations of all countries, then indeed there would hardly be any conflict, and certainly no war. However, soon after 1950, in a swift military action, China captured Tibet. Tibet was an independent Buddhist nation in the Himalayas, landlocked between India and China, along the northern front of Indian border. Tibet was a peaceful Buddhist country and had little contact with the rest of the world. Tibet was ruled by its political and spiritual leader, Dalai Lama. By now, the Chinese Communist Party had firmly established itself under the leadership of Chinese government, led by Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong and the Premier, Zhou Enlai. The annexation of Tibet by China was in fact just the beginning of Chinese expansionist policies, and the Chinese army invaded and captured Tibet against the wishes of its people. China annexed Tibet and declared Tibet as part of China in year 1950. The Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet was vehemently opposed by Tibetan people, led by their spiritual leader, Dalai Lama. Surprisingly, despite strong objections raised by Western countries and the US, the Indian government decided to remain completely silent on this Chinese invasion and illegal occupation of Tibet. The communist Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1950 led to the revolt against Chinese occupation in 1959 and years of turmoil in Tibet. The Chinese military action against these protests led to the complete overthrow of the Tibetan government, led by Dalai Lama. The Tibet issue created a major refugee crisis for India. The Tibetan spiritual leader Dalai Lama, along with 100,000 Tibetans, were forced to flee from Tibet and moved to India in self-imposed exile in 1959. The Indian government, led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, had decided to offer shelter to Tibetan leader Dalai Lama and also to the large number of Tibetan population purely on humanitarian grounds. However, China viewed this action as hostile act by India, and became suspicious about Indian intentions. The India's action to offer shelter to spiritual leader Dalai Lama created a major rift between India and China. US had extended full support to India on Tibet issue. Soon after this, Dalai Lama formed Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala, in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh in India. China viewed these developments as Indian support for the people of Tibet and their aspiration for independence from Chinese occupation. India-China boundary dispute was another major reason that led to this military conflict between India and China. India and China share a boundary that spread across in three sectors. On eastern sector, along Arunachal Pradesh, and this area is also referred as NEFA region, that is National Eastern Frontier Authority. The central sector, along the Sikkim, and the western sector, along Aksai Chin Area. Inspired by the success in illegally capturing Tibet, China's next target was India. India became relatively a soft target, due to weak Indian leadership and the ill-equipped Indian army. China illegally captured Tibet and also claims the Indian territory of Arunachal Pradesh, NEFA region, as a part of South Tibet. China in the past had proposed to accept the Indian claim on Indian territory of Arunachal Pradesh NEFA in eastern sector against the Chinese claim on Aksai Chin in the western sector. Aksai Chin area, historically, has always been a part of Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. China always wanted to capture the Indian Aksai Chin area due to its strategically important location. The Chinese strategy was to first put a claim on Arunachal Pradesh as part of South Tibet, and then exchange against Indian claim on Aksai Chin area in the western sector. However, this was completely unacceptable to the Indian government. The NEFA region in the eastern sector is the largest Indian territory claimed by China, covering around 90,000 square kilometre, and India had completely rejected the Chinese claim. This area was formerly called as NEFA, that is, Northeast Frontier Agency, and currently referred as Arunachal Pradesh. China has claimed this entire area of Arunachal Pradesh, and wants to use this area as leverage to negotiate with India for strategically important Aksai Chin area on the western sector. And for this reason, China had always objected to the visit of Dalai Lama to Tuang Monastery as a reminder to its untenable claim on Indian territory. During the 1962 war, the Chinese army had intruded almost 60 kilometers inside the Indian territory of NEFA region. However, after the ceasefire, the Chinese army went back to the previous position before the war. The line actual control is represented by the McMahon line on the map. This line is the current international boundary between India and China. The 1962 India-China War started with a dispute over the sovereignty of the widely separated Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh border regions. Aksai Chin area, claimed by India, historically belongs to Indian state of Kashmir. China has also claimed Aksai Chin as a part of Chinese Xinjiang region. Aksai Chin area contains an important road link that connects the Chinese regions of Tibet and Xinjiang. China has already accepted the Indian annexation of state of Sikkim as part of India in 2006. However, China wants to use the Sikkim card to pressurize the Indian government against the Tibetan leader, Dalai Lama's activities in India. Before 1962 war, the Indian territory Aksai Chin was not being regularly patrolled by the Indian forces. India had also not developed any road network and other support infrastructure in Aksai Chin area. Taking advantage of non-presence Indian forces in Aksai Chin area, the Chinese unilaterally started the road construction and also constructed forward posts for the Chinese army. India's lack of patrolling in Aksai Chin area helped the Chinese to construct the roads inside the Indian territory of Aksai Chin without getting noticed by Indian forces. By the time these Chinese activities came to India's notice, China had already built a road. India had strongly objected to these Chinese activities. In order to counter the Chinese activities, India started conducting regular patrolling and the forward deployment of Indian forces along the border in Aksai Chin area. By 1961, regular skirmishes started taking place between the Indian and Chinese forces deployed along the border and the Chinese forces started regularly attacking the Indian troops patrolling the Indian border. However, despite these Chinese provocations, the Indian political leadership failed to sense the Chinese intentions and also did not initiate any defensive measures necessary to defend the Indian borders. The Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had to face the wrath of opposition parties who severely criticized his China policy. The main opposition party BJP, led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, had even brought, for the first time, a no-confidence motion against his Congress government. Now, the opposition had also started building up, within the Congress party itself, against Prime Minister Nehru's lenient approach to China. By 1959, India-China border witnessed a series of violent border clashes between Indian and Chinese forces deployed along the border. The Tibetan people had also started revolt and were also up in arms against the Chinese occupation. The Western Bloc countries were actively supporting Dalai Lama, and the pressure had started building up against China. India had also initiated the forward policy, which mainly consists of forward deployment of Indian army posts along the border, intended to strengthen the Indian defences. As forward policy, India built several posts along the north of the McMahon Line and also along the eastern front of line of actual control. China viewed this Indian defences as aggressive posture by India. The alarming rise in the frequent clashes between the two armies, and now it was evident that war is now imminent. However, despite these events, the Indian leadership decided to remain in a false sense of security, and no efforts were made to prepare for the war. In fact, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and his Defence Minister V.K. Krishna Menon were warned by then Army Chief General Thimaeya, who had submitted a detailed report on the urgent measures needed to strengthen the Indian defences along the Chinese border. Surprisingly, this report was ignored, stating as alarmist. On the 20th of October 1962, the Chinese army launched a surprise attack on the India border, and the first war between India and China had just begun. The Chinese forces launched attack simultaneously on two fronts along Indian border. On the western front, China invaded Aksai Chin, and on the eastern front, Chinese army troops also crossed the McMahon Line and attacked the Indian troops. This war was completely a one-sided war, as neither the Indian political leadership nor the Indian army had prepared for this war. The Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was in a complete state of shock, as he had blindly trusted the Chinese leadership and never expected China to launch an attack on India. As a result, the Chinese troops could easily advance over Indian forces in both the eastern and western sector. The ill-equipped Indian army soldiers were fighting with Second World War .303 bolt-action rifles, which could fire only one bullet at a time, whereas the Chinese army was equipped with the latest .47 automatic assault rifles, recently acquired from Russia. Due to lack of preparation, the Indian army could deploy only 20,000 soldiers, fighting against 80,000 strong, well-equipped Chinese soldiers. Despite these limitations, the Indian soldiers fought and laid down their lives to defend the motherland till last bullet. The Chinese leadership had successfully managed to give a false sense of security to the Indian leadership. By now, it was evident that China had been planning and preparing for this war for a long time. The Chinese army had very well prepared for this war and had established crucial supply lines to provide the necessary support to the advancing Chinese troops. China-India War lasted for almost 1 month and ended with the unilateral ceasefire declared by China on the 20th of November 1962, as China had achieved the objectives. In this war, India had lost entire Western Front, which includes Aksai Chin Area, to China. China had captured Aksai Chin in this war, and this area still continues to be under the Chinese occupation. On the Eastern Front, in NEFA region, that is Arunachal Pradesh area, the Chinese army had advanced 60 kilometers, right inside the McMahon Line. However, the Chinese army went back to their previous positions after the war ended, and vacated the area captured during the war on the Eastern Front, NEFA region. Now, let us analyze and understand what went wrong for India in this war, and find answers to important question, that is, why India lost India-China War in 1962. After the war ended, the government of India appointed a committee to analyze Sino-Indian War, and this committee submitted a detailed report. This report is referred to as Henderson Brooks Begats report. The findings of this report are still confidential and have not been declassified by the Indian government till date. However, based on the media reports and the information available in the public domain, following factors were found to be responsible for India's defeat in this India-China War. 1. Failure to access the border situation by the Indian political leadership. 2. Failure of the Indian Defence Ministry. 3. Diplomatic failure. 4. Leadership failure by some Indian Army officers. 5. Lack of infrastructure along India-China border. 6. Lack of preparation and training by the Indian Army. 7. Indian intelligence failure. 8. India did not use Indian Air Force. 9. Superior Chinese leadership planning and well-equipped Chinese army. Let us now discuss each of these issues in detail. Now, the first question, why Indian leadership failed in the assessment of deteriorating situation along the border, despite clear indications by Chinese actions. The Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru's China policy, had completely failed, and his personal friendship with Chinese leadership could not stop the Chinese invasion of India. Prime Minister Nehru could not make a realistic assessment of the deteriorating situation on the border and the Chinese intentions, despite the chain of events and repeated attacks on Indian troops deployed on the border. Prime Minister Nehru's personal ambition to become a world leader did not allow him to take a firm stand against the Chinese expansionist policies. The opposition parties in India often severely criticized his soft and lenient approach to China. Further, India did not protest or oppose the illegal Chinese annexation of Tibet. India also failed to align with Western countries, including the United States, against the Chinese aggression on Tibet. India also did not raise the issue of illegal Chinese occupation of Tibet at United Nations and the atrocities committed by the Chinese armed forces on Tibetan people who protested against the invasion of their motherland. The Indian defeat also raises a serious question mark on the performance and the role of the Defence Ministry. Prime Minister Nehru also could not decisively act on the recommendations of the Indian Army General, K.S. Thimayya, who served as Indian Army Chief during this crucial period of 1959 to 1961. The failure of the Indian Defence Ministry was one of the major factors responsible for the Indian defeat in this war. The Indian Defence Ministry was headed by Defence Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, who was a very controversial person. Despite being a defence minister, he had suggested that India does not need armed forces, as both Pakistan and China are India's friends. He had also closed down many ammunition factories to reduce defence expenditure, which turned out to be fatal for the Indian armed forces. But he was considered to be very close to the Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the second most powerful person after the Prime Minister in India. One of the most important factors responsible for India's defeat in this war was the lack of preparedness of Indian armed forces, especially the Indian Army. During his tenure as Defence Minister, V.K. Krishna Menon is severely criticised for his failure to modernise the Indian armed forces. He is also accused of completely undermining the impending threat of Chinese invasion, despite being warned by then Indian Army Chief. The most glaring and serious lapse during his tenure as Defence Minister was his failure to act on that report recommended by then Army Chief General K.S. Thimayya. This report had warned and highlighted the impending threat of Chinese attack and the required preparation by the Indian Army. General Thimayya had recommended to strengthen the Indian defences based on the report submitted by his deputy, Lieutenant General S.P. Thorat, who had prepared a detailed report on the changing situation along the Chinese border in NEFA area, and the impending threat of Chinese invasion. This report was forwarded by General S.V. Thimayya to the Defence Minister, Krishna Menon. However, Defence Minister Krishna Menon completely ignored this most important report and did not act on this crucial strategic input. The Defence Minister V.K. Krishna Menon also had major differences with Army Chief General K.S. Thimayya on many issues. Because of these differences, General K.S. Thimayya had even tendered his resignation, which was later on he had revoked, after the intervention from Prime Minister Nehru. The Defence Minister V.K. Krishna Menon had to resign in the middle of the ongoing war, but he was continued as an advisor to Prime Minister Nehru. The 1962 Sino-Indian War, also a culmination of failure of the Indian diplomacy. Although Prime Minister Nehru had a sizable clout in international diplomacy. However, the Indian foreign policy had failed to resolve the border dispute with China. The Indian leadership had ignored the Chinese claims till 1955. The alarm bell started ringing when China's publications started showing major portion of western Aksai Chin Area and the eastern NEFA area as Chinese territory. However, despite these Chinese provocations, the Indian leadership remained silent on these issues, instead of taking up these issues with China through diplomatic channels. The Indian forward policy of deploying the army posts in the forward positions along the area claimed by China also backfired. Further, these posts were not even provided crucial support, including arms and ammunition. The Chinese forces soon started attacking these Indian forward posts. The 1962 India-China War and the subsequent Indian defeat was a major blow to Prime Minister Nehru. He had never expected such betrayal by China. His famous slogan of "Hindi Shini Bye Bye" had turned into open hostility between the two countries. Another reason for India's defeat in this war was the lack of infrastructure along the India-China border. The Chinese forces were relatively very well prepared, and China had also created the necessary infrastructure, including the network of roads, in border areas. Whereas, the Indian side was totally unprepared, and the absence of roads along the border areas caused major problems for the movement of Indian troops and for providing the crucial supplies to the forward Indian portions. Another reason for this debacle was the failure of Indian intelligence. The failure of crucial intelligence inputs and lack of such crucial information helped the Chinese army to keep the element of surprise in this operation. Till 1962, India did not even have a dedicated external intelligence agency. This war was said to be the greatest intelligence failure in Indian history. However, after the war, in year 1968, the Indian government decided to establish the Research and Analysis Wing (RAW), which is now a dedicated external intelligence agency. The RAW was established in 1968, following the intelligence failures of the Sino-Indian War. This decision has helped India during 1971 war with Pakistan. Surprisingly, in this war, India did not use the Indian Air Force. The 1962 Sino-Indian War was mainly fought between the two armies. The fear of escalation kept the Indian leadership away from using the Indian Air Force. Although, during this war, the Indian Air Force was relatively better equipped, and experts believe its use could have been very effective. The Indian Air Force in 1962 had a sizable number of combat aircraft, which includes Hunter, Mystère fighters, and the Canberra medium bombers. The Indian Air Force infantry also had a squadron of photo reconnaissance Canberra and some relatively old, 75 in number, slow-speed, less capable Tuafani and Vampire fighters, and also 30 Gant Mark I fighters. The Indian reconnaissance planes had spotted the Chinese movements and the road construction activities across the border. The subsequent analysis revealed that the use of Indian Air Force could have made a big difference in this war. By not using the Indian Air Force, India failed to leverage the upper hand in air superiority as compared to Chinese Air Force. Another factor that has helped China to win this war was the element of surprise. The Chinese leadership had managed diplomatic engagement with India with military precision. The Chinese leadership had successfully managed to keep the Chinese intentions and the war preparation a closely guarded secret. Subsequently, it was evident that China had been planning and preparing for this war for a long time. The Chinese leadership had successfully managed to give a false sense of security to the Indian leadership, which helped the Chinese army to launch this surprise attack, which caught the Indian side completely off guard. The India-China war could not get much international attention, primarily due to prevailing Cuban Missile Crises, which kept both Russia and the United States engaged. The international media was also distracted and remained focused on Cuban Missile Crises, which brought the world closer to the nuclear war. Prime Minister Nehru had approached President Kennedy for help. India being a democracy, U.S. response was favorable to India. The U.S. had come to India's rescue and helped India with arms. U.S. had also agreed to intervene and provide the military support to the Indian forces. In fact, the U.S. had kept the plans ready to send the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal to support Indian forces. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union, India's old trusted friend, had taken a neutral stand in India-China war, despite its serious ideological differences with China. The Soviet press reports had also tilted towards China. The Soviet Union's tilt towards China became clear when the Soviet Union suspended the crucial supplies for MiG fighters under the agreement reached between the two sides in August 1962. However, these supply was resumed by Russia after the war ended. Now, the most important question: has India learned any lesson? And the answer is unfortunately no. Let us face this reality. The India-China border dispute still continues to be unresolved. The Indian territory of Aksai Chin, captured by China during the war, continues to be under the Chinese possession. The discussion between India and China at various levels have so far not yielded any meaningful resolution for border dispute. Although both Indian and Chinese economies have significantly expanded, and also the military might. However, the gap in the military capabilities has grown, and that too in China's favor. The Indian military capabilities could not keep the same pace as that of China during the Congress Party rule of 70 years over India after the independence. The reports of corruption scams in major weapon system acquisition programs during the Congress rule has deprived the Indian armed forces from getting the latest weapons, which has adversely affected the Indian military modernization program. Although there has been considerable improvement in the Indian military modernization process after Narendra Modi government came to power in 2014. The Modi government has also initiated major infrastructure projects and the development of road network along India-China border to improve the border infrastructure. However, the gap between India and Chinese military capabilities is considerably high in China's favor. For example, China has already developed and inducted the fifth-generation fighter aircraft, whereas the Indian fourth-generation light combat aircraft, Tejas fighter aircraft project, still continues to be in the development stage. There has been a considerable decline in Indian Air Force combat capabilities, primarily due to the declining number of Indian Air Force squadron numbers. The Indian Air Force squadron number has declined to a dangerously low level of 31 squadrons, as against required strength of 42 squadrons, needed to effectively face the two-front war simultaneously with China and Pakistan. The Indian political party's compulsions to politicize every major weapon acquisition program for the armed forces runs into some trouble, which is adversely affecting the Indian military modernization program. The recent Trafalgar deal signed by the Modi government with France is yet another example of how a conflicting political interest can override the national interest. The French Dassault Trafalgar aircraft is a 4.5+ generation fighter aircraft, which will give the Indian Air Force a clear edge over its adversaries. So, what is the conclusion? The India-China relations have been severely affected due to unprovoked Chinese aggression. Although the economic and the trade ties between the two countries have considerably improved because it is in Chin's favor. The booming Indian economy and the rapidly growing consumer market in India offers a huge potential for the Chinese companies. It is now clear that China, at this point of time, does not want to settle the boundary dispute with India for obvious reasons. China views the booming Indian economy and the rapidly growing Indian military strength as a serious potential threat to its main objective of being a superpower by dislodging the United States. China is equally concerned about the growing warmth in relations and the strategic alliance shaping up between India and US. However, China is pretty much aware of the Indian weakness and the vulnerability. China believes that, in the event of military conflict with India, China will have upper hand and therefore, keeping the border dispute unresolved suits China at this point of time. The Chinese army still regularly intrudes into the Indian territory without any fear, deliberately to keep the pressure on the Indian leadership, and also as a reminder to keep the untenable Chinese territorial claims. Further, China will continue to take such liberties with India in future, primarily due to limitations of Indian responses to such border violations by China. As a counter-strategy, India needs to rapidly modernize its armed forces and build the military muscle to create effective deterrence, and then negotiate with China from the position of strength. India should also continue to play a leadership role in forging the Quad alliance, rapidly shaping up between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. The Quad alliance is necessary for the regional security and to contain the Chinese territorial ambitions and expansionist policies under control. The recent standoff between Indian and Chinese armies at claim is clear indication of Modi government's resolve to take the China head-on, if need be. The Chinese hostile attitude and anti-India policies will be counterproductive, which will push India to play a crucial role against the Chinese interest. The border dispute with China can be resolved only when India significantly improves its military capability, which will allow India to negotiate with China from the position of strength. China is currently exploiting the Indian weaknesses in the military capabilities as a result of continuous neglect by successive Indian governments. Whereas the main Chinese objective is to contain India under the pretext of border dispute. India cannot be a financial superpower without being a military superpower. India also needs to develop closer economic ties with China on mutually beneficial terms. The geopolitical compulsions constrained China to settle the border dispute with Russia. Similarly, the ongoing Chinese trade war between the US and China might create a favorable situation for both India and China to settle the border dispute once and for all. This is a crucial period for both Chinese and Indian economy. China needs the Indian market, and India needs Chinese investment. And therefore, India should continue to engage with China to find a political resolution to the border dispute between the two countries. We can only hope, at this point of time, that rationality would prevail, and both India and China will soon work out a win-win solution. That brings us to the end of this episode on India-China War in 1962. Thanks for watching, and India Defence News look forward to see you soon with another interesting topic. If you have liked this video, then please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, India Defence News. Thanks and bye for now. Jai Hind.